Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, it's Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. It's the year 1970, and TV host Dick Cavett has just asked his guest an unusual question. Cavett turns to the guest, who's singer-songwriter Paul Simon, and starts by saying, "It's possibly an impossible question."
This is maybe an impossible question, but anybody who can really create something, there's always a mystery of how does it happen. I mean, there was a moment in time when Bridge Over Troubled Water didn't exist at all. And then there was another moment when it did, or when it started to. Where does it come from? What actually happens? Were you in the shower one day and some of the lyrics came to you, or
no?
How does it?
I could tell you that.
Could you?
Take me a minute, though. Are you going to break?
Go ahead. We may break, but go ahead anyway.
Oh well.
No, we won't.
Let's see now.
You looking for?
Yeah, I'm just looking for my
guitar. Oh, it's right here. We just happened to put it behind there.
I wasn't planning on doing this, but I'll show you how it actually started. So it started out with me singing a song. The beginning of the song I had. Da 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 da. Now this part. That comes from a Bach piece. That comes from a Bach chorale. So that was in my mind. So that's how that part slipped in. Then when you're really feeling small. I was stuck there. That was all I had of that melody.
What makes you stuck?
I didn't know where. Well, everywhere I went led me where I didn't want to be, so I was stuck.
The best definition of being stuck I've heard in a long time.
As we listen to those words, we realize that we aren't stuck when we're washing the dishes. We aren't stuck when we are brushing our teeth. Sending a text message or ordering a chai is mostly a mundane affair. Getting stuck involves doing something new. The problem is that the newness is always accompanied by complexity. And if you are teaching a toddler the English alphabet, you're unlikely to tackle more than one letter of the alphabet at a time. You'd wait until they get a good handle on A before you move to B, and then slowly to C. However, the moment we move out of toddlerhood, we're hit with this newness and complexity at the same time. When you're learning how to drive a car, you don't sit in the car for a while. You get in the car, and then you expect it to drive almost immediately. You have to figure out the road, the pedestrians, all of the gears. It's all of it new and complex at the same time. Even when you're good at something, for example, writing an article, you still have to deal with the fact that you're writing about something new and different, like I am now. At this point, it's normal to get stuck, but there's an icky feeling that it's just you. It's at this point that we want to go faster. We want to get to the end. We want to finish this project because it's driving us crazy. But let's go slightly counterintuitive. Let's go slower. Let's take these stages, these steps, or if you want to call them elements. So there are 3 elements. The first is borrowing. The second is to focus on the point, not the set. And finally, to go into explainer mode. Let's start out with the first one, which is borrowing. Remember Paul Simon's interview with Dick Cavett? Like most of us, Simon seems to start confidently. He gets an idea for a song, then he launches into the melody for the first line. And the very second line seems to trip him up. What does he do? He borrows from Bach. Almost immediately, the thought that comes to mind is the concept of plagiarism. Yet borrowing is nuanced. Plagiarism is a rip-off. It's copying someone else's work in its entirety and pretending that it's your own. Borrowing tends to be more of a starting point. Take, for example, a new website that I started in late January. It was the tail end of our summer holiday because summer begins in December in the Southern Hemisphere. For the past 2 years, I had gotten myself obsessed with taking photos, purely as a hobby. 17,000 photos later, I had nowhere to display them. Every year, I print at least 1 or 2, maybe even 3 thick photo books. They contain family photos. But at the same time, all of these pictures of New Zealand were piling up on my computer and on the backups. How many photos, you may ask? Well, about 17,000 in the past couple of years. It was time, I decided, to design a new website. Except I had no idea where to go. How do you design something that meets with your taste when you don't know where to start? I did what I always do. I borrowed. When we first started out psychotactics.com, and this is about 20 years ago, the format for the website was pretty straightforward. All websites looked more or less the same. They were built on tables of frames, and you'd have a box to the left, then the main text, and then the box to the right, and of course the navigation bar at the top. These kinds of websites ran into the use-by date, and then it was time to design a second version. Except I had no idea where to start. While browsing, I landed on the site by my friend and designer John McQuaid, and so I decided, I really like John's site. I'm going to do something similar. So the core of the site, the core design of the site was John McQuaid's site, the way he laid out his site. The question is, did the Psychotactic site, look exactly like John's site? If you held them side by side, you might find 2 or 3 elements that possibly overlap each other, but that could be the case for any 2 sites on the internet. Where is the borrowing if you can't see it? Yet it's there, because that's where you start. That's where I started. The same principle applied to the photography site, which is called theotherseandesouza.com, by the way. So there I was, keen to get up a website, and I wanted it in January, because that's when we were still on a break. As you'd expect, I was stuck. The first thing I did was to look online for some inspiration. Yet, inspiration alone is not enough when it comes to a layout. Hence, I simply copied the structure of photographer Gavin Goff. Once again, if you were to go to gavingoff.com, go there right now if you need to, and compare his site with ours, and you'd go, what is this guy talking about? There is almost nothing in common. And this is what borrowing is all about. It's about a framework. It's a starting point. And you think, well, I don't want this starting point. I want to start afresh. I want to be original. And you can't be. Because there is no such thing as original. Magician Darren Brown proves this point on a YouTube video. He drives 2 advertising executives on a prearranged route in a remarkable experiment. 2 members of Saatchi & Saatchi, which is the world-famous ad company, They are taken on a car ride to their eventual destination. Brown tells them that they have to come up with a poster for a product. The product happens to be taxidermy stores. Those are the stores that stuff dead animals. It's a chain of stores, he tells them, and you're supposed to come up with a strapline or slogan for them, as well as the picture. 20 minutes is all they have to complete the project. Brown also casually leaves a covered version of his ideas. And he says that together they can look at the ideas, their ideas, his ideas, and see if there is any overlap. The deadline doesn't have a hard stop at 20 minutes. He gives them a little extra time. And then it's time for the presentation. And here's what the two executives come up with. Name of company, out of Africa. Slogan, as good as it gets. Graphics, kid crying, a lizard saying mommy, and a man with a stuffed lion in the backseat of a car. At this point, Darren Brown reaches for his work, the stuff that he had kept in advance that was closed that nobody saw, and then he asks them to open the envelope. And they start giggling. Brown's sequence is like this. Name of company, out of Africa. Slogan, as real as you like. Graphics, dinosaur creature saying mommy. Brown then brings up the topic of polar bears, and the advertising executives nod because they did polar bears, but they didn't show him the images. And if you're wondering, how did all of this happen? It's because of how things are set up. The executives run into specific slogans, graphics, and even a group of people crossing the road with t-shirts and the word polar bear quite prominently on their chest. This is the drive. They go from point A to point B. But each of these terms, slogans, and images repeat themselves along the way in different forms. Dinosaurs and balloons, a man carrying a dinosaur toy, and so on. By the time the executives get down to doing their assignment, they don't have much of a problem because they are borrowing without knowing it. The reality is that it's impossible not to borrow. We all have to borrow, whether we're making coffee, learning a language, or creating a new rocket ship. If someone says that their work is utterly original, you can smile, wave, and slowly back away from them. That's because we have no choice but to borrow. However, our childhood has been tainted by people who have told us repeatedly that we should not copy, we should not trace. It's terrible advice to begin with. But it goes deep into our system, very deep into our consciousness. And then we try to be original at all times. Instead, start with borrowing. If you have to create a new mascot, start with Sonic the Hedgehog or Porky Pig. If you're building a website, start with someone else's layout. If you're writing a book, maybe you don't want to copy how the words flow. Copy the structure of the book. Borrowing from Bach isn't as bad as an idea as you'd believe. No one is saying that you should photocopy the other person's work. In fact, if you have their work right in front of you, then you can compare your final product with where you started. And that's when you see that transition. That's when you see that evolution of ideas. And that's your first stage for getting unstuck. Which takes us to the second element, which is to focus on the point, not the set. Think of a loud, argumentative tennis player from the 80s, and most people will think of John McEnroe.
The ball chalk came up all over.
No, it was a bit of a spread, Mr. McEnroe. That was a good call.
Excuse me?
That was a bit of a spread.
Look, you can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious! That ball was on the line. chalk flew up.
That's what John McEnroe would shout at the umpire. He'd curse. He'd throw his racket into the ground so that it bounced like a ball. McEnroe's tantrums and meltdowns got him the name Super Brat. On the other hand, one of McEnroe's most significant rivals on the court was Bjorn Borg. Borg, a Swedish player, number 1 in the world, was known as the Iceman. Always very calm on court, his demeanor rarely wavered. Except this wasn't how Borg described his starting point. "I was a real nutcase," Borg said. "I swore, I threw my racket around, I cheated." Sweden's tennis authorities, appalled at his behavior, banned him for 6 months. He was even prevented from practicing at his club. The amazing turnaround from bad boy / cheat to Iceborg can be credited to his coach Lennart Bergelin. 1 point at a time, not the set, seemed to be Bergelin's advice to Borg. Bergelin was obviously referring to the game of tennis, where you play point by point. Like everybody else, a tennis player is focused on the set, but he wanted to slow him down. And the same concept applies to us. No matter what project we are currently tackling, the overwhelm comes in from the vastness of the project. For instance, I was working on a sales page for a course. As the summer vacation wound down and I headed back to work on the 1st of Feb, I was still very much working on my photography site. But there was another pressing issue, the sales page for the storytelling course that we were going to hold in April of the same year. That's this year, by the way. Like most people, I pretended that every other task was important. However, I had a fixed deadline of 5 days. What wasn't helping very much was that New Zealand has a surge of public holidays at the tail end of January. While everybody else was having a great time, I didn't want to be cooped up in the office. 1 point at a time, not the set. Okay, so it's not some great advice. After all, you have got advice like a journey of 1,000 miles begins with 1 step. Even so, the 1 point stuck with me. I started working for just 30 minutes at a stretch. When the time was up, I'd be done for the morning or even for the day. Not being bound to the computer screen meant that I could focus on the point. The 5-day deadline stretched to 8. However, I'd focus on working for about 30 minutes and longer, but only if I felt like it. And then I'd write the bullets for the sales page one day and then stop. The next day, I'd write just the headlines for the benefits and features and then bring the day to a close. The following days were dedicated to uniqueness and then to graphics. 1 point and then another point and then another point, and before you knew it, I'd got the set. I'd finished the sales page. And if you were to take Lennart Bergelin's concept a little further, what we also get is recovery time. You play your shot, maybe you hit it in the net, but then you walk back to your spot where you have to serve or take the serve, and you're not running around. You have time to recompose yourself. So there's recovery time. Then you focus on the next point. It doesn't matter if you're the top player in the world. It matters not if you can write sales letters in your sleep. Every project has its own challenges that confuse you just enough to get you stuffed, to get you stuck. But a point, that is just a point. That's at least what I do. Even if the deadline needs a little bit of rubber banding, which is just extending it a bit, playing 1 point at a time keeps things sane. Think of all the things that you have to do. Maybe you're reading a book you haven't finished. Maybe you've got a course that you haven't looked at. And that's because we tend to think of the end point. But if you look at it as 1 paragraph at a time, or 1 page at a time, or 1 chapter at a time, now we have 1 point. And you play that point and the next point, and you get recovery, and then you know you've won the set. It is still a journey of 1,000 miles begins with just one step. But one point at a time, not the set, seems modern, it seems doable. And that's the second step in getting unstuck. We started out with borrowing, and then we went to focus on the point, not the set, which then takes us to the third part, which is probably the most efficient way, which is to get into explainer mode. But what is explainer mode? Let's find out in the third part. You know how you're sometimes in a conversation, you're paying attention to one conversation, but then somebody says your name and then you start listening to the other one. It can be confusing because now you have to do two things simultaneously. Explainer mode is a bit like that. Someone will ask me, what is this new website about? And frankly, I'm stuck for the answer. For example, if you take the photography website that I've been talking about, it's not clear what I'm trying to achieve. The short story is that I bought a Sony, that's a camera, and then I bought a Leica, which is another camera, and then I bought another Leica, which is a third camera, and I got hooked on taking pictures. At first, I didn't even know what pictures I wanted to take. I'd do some architecture, a lot of people, and a token number of landscapes. So if you asked me, what is the website about? I don't have a clear answer. That lack of clarity means that the project seems to waver as well. And it doesn't matter which project you're working on. And this applies to all the stuff that we do as well. Maybe you were writing an article, or maybe you're writing a book. What is the article about? What is the book about? What are you trying to achieve? And this is where explainer mode comes into play. You talk, but you're also listening to yourself. People often comment that the brain audit is quite a cool name for a book. I got that name because I was explaining to someone what the book was all about. I had no idea what the book was about because it was just about these 7 red bags, all of these chapters together. I had no clear idea where I was going with it. But somewhere in some conversation, I would have said something like, oh, it's an audit. It helps you check stuff as you go along. It's pretty much how the brain works when you're making a decision. I guess you could call it a brain audit. Bingo. We have a name. The brain audit. The same applied to the membership site at 5000 BC. You have to admit it's an odd name, with all gorgeously catchy names like Inner Circle and 7-Figure Club. We chose 5000bc.com to be the name of the membership site. How did that come about? Again, it was the explanation. I would have said something like, not a lot has changed in over 5,000 years. 5000bc.com. There you go. What we find time and time again is that getting stuck is normal. And getting out of that stuck zone involves explaining yourself. We should all be so lucky to explain ourselves once and quickly get out of the mess. However, it may take you several passes before you find that elegance with which to express what you're doing. There's also a good chance that when you're explaining yourself, the other person will look at you as though you're not making any sense at all. In which case, you should encourage them to ask more questions. As they ask those questions, you explain yourself a little further, and then maybe nothing comes of it. Maybe you just go back to your office, to home, to wherever you came from, and then your brain is working on it in the background. And the next time somebody asks you, you explain yourself. Maybe it's the 6th time, maybe it's the 13th time, but at some point you will have those two conversations, or have that conversation where you're explaining yourself and then the other ear is listening and you go, wow. That's the name. That's the idea. That's what I'm really doing. When I'm stuck, I will often talk to my wife, Renuka. But just as often, she'll be saying something to me about her problems. And it's like a comedy of errors. She's talking about her problem, I'm talking about my problem. We're both talking about each other's problems and only hearing ourselves. And then, she'll say, and then she'll rush off to the office with the solution of her own making. Just thinking of the problem aloud has sorted it out in her mind. And we've all done this. We've started to write a letter and then we go, oh, yeah, I get it. Or we write a post in the forum, and as we're writing it, it clarifies the whole concept to us. We don't always need somebody else to figure it out. It's nice to have a conversation with someone, but just explaining ourselves to ourselves or to somebody else is what causes that one level of getting unstuck. We all get stuck. We don't always know how to get unstuck. So there are 3 parts to it. The first part is to borrow. Start with a template, not your own template, somebody else's template. It's a draft, it's a framework, and it's really good because when you finish your own, you can compare, is there a lot of overlap? Is there just a little overlap? And there's a very good chance that it will not be a copy. So start with borrowing. The second is focus on the point, not the set. Always the point, not the set. And finally, explain yourself. Write down the stuff that you're thinking about. You will be able to clarify it to yourself. Maybe not the first time, maybe the 6th time, maybe the 13th time, but explain yourself. And if you can, explain yourself to others, because when you see them being confused, they can ask you questions, or you can ask them to ask you questions. And the more you explain yourself, the more you get that clarity. Which, of course, brings us to the end of this podcast. So what's the one thing that I would do more than all of these 3 points? And that is focus on the point, not the set. Focus on the point, not the set. Put that up somewhere. Put that on your computer. Focus on the point, not the set. Take only 15 minutes, do something, stop, and then come back another day. Get that recovery time, and then the next one and the next one. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics land. This year, there is no article writing course, but one of the key facets of writing is storytelling. If you can tell stories, you can stand up and do a podcast, you can speak in front of an audience, you can give a eulogy. You are a champion when you can tell stories. And most people struggle with stories because they don't know if their story is boring, they don't know how the audience will react to their story, and that's what the storytelling course is all about. The course is going to start in April, but we're going to start pre-selling it soon enough. If you would like to go on the list, on the waiting list, and there are only 18 seats, so it's a live course, go to psychotactics.com/storytelling, and yep, that's where all the magic is. This also happens to be the first new recorded podcast in 2022, so Happy New Year. And we'll see you in 5000bc.com. Still listening? I like beer when it's really hot and the beer is really cold. In fact, it has to be in the freezer for about 7 minutes before I even enjoy it. And Renuka is the same. She likes a chilled beer, but she doesn't need it to be hot outside. Any day is a good day for beer. And she orders her favorite beer, which is Hallertau No. 2. Well, they sent a whole case. And yeah, we bought it. They didn't just send it. We bought the case. And then she opened a few beers and they were kind of spilling over every time you opened it. She wrote an email to them asking them if there was a problem, why that was happening. And they explained the whole issue. But then they sent her a whole additional case of beer. And then there was some other problem and she wrote to them and then they sent another case of beer, and now we're stuck with multiple cases of beer. Yes, there are different ways to get stuck. It's a good problem to have, but it's one beer at a time. 1 point, not the set. Bye for now.